Film treatment. Crematorium. Step 1. Prologue. Friday evening in Pescadero near San Francisco. Luxury villa next to the ocean. Noisy party outside. One of the guests, Frank Baffett, apologizes to the owner of the villa. He has to leave, and his pregnant wife is waiting for him at home. The host of the party says goodbye and reminds us that on Monday the corporation will decide on a tender worth $75 million. The driver, a graying black man, opens the limousine door for Frank. Some distance away, in a light-colored van, two men are watching in the dark. The limousine moves. The van follows a little behind. Suddenly, a police car pulls out of a cross street. With its hazard lights on, it catches up with the limousine. After checking the documents, the policeman is stuck on the fact that traffic rules have been broken and that a pedestrian crossing the road has not been missed. The driver is surprised. There are no people around. The policeman says ironically, "And you haven't noticed the Holy Spirit?" When the driver gets lost, the policeman quips, "It's just a joke. Are you driving Frank Baffett?" he asks, and shows the driver an arrest warrant in Baffett's name. Meanwhile, a light van pulls up alongside. Two men get out. They take Frank out of the limousine, handcuff him, and lead him away. A police car drives off as if nothing had happened. A man claiming to be an FBI officer suddenly hits the limousine driver with the handle of a pistol. After pushing the intoxicated black man aside, he gets behind the wheel himself. After a while, both cars drive into an unlit area. Production buildings. Frank is led down a flight of stairs into a gloomy room. He is handcuffed to a metal chair. After switching off the light, the kidnappers leave Baffett alone in the dark and leave. Night, thick fog, water all around. A van and a limousine are parked on the deck of a small ferry. Inside the limousine, a black driver is tied up, his mouth taped shut. The man's eyes are terrified. The men push the limousine off the deck and into the water. The car sinks with a gurgle. In his helpless state, the driver sees water pouring through the limousine windows. A limousine hits the bottom and jolts, causing a ripple. The black man is torn in agony. He realizes he is about to get drunk. The silhouette of the ferry on which the bandits' van is parked recedes into the mist. Step 2. A bird's-eye view of San Francisco International Airport. An American Airlines Boeing 747 lands. Joe Harden, a 45-year-old FBI officer arriving from New York, is greeted by his colleagues. Joe reads a newspaper in the FBI's San Francisco office. The front page features a photo of Frank Baffett, a wealthy businessman. This is the 7th missing businessman in the last 4 months. The circumstances of this case, like the previous ones, are shrouded in mystery. The driver of Baffett's limousine is also missing. According to press statistics, 37 victims of missing businessmen, including their entourage, have been recorded. The series of mysterious kidnappings was interrupted for 3 months a year ago, after a sensational TV incident involving a ransom of millions of diamonds. A single businessman was rescued, but he refused to cooperate with law enforcement. Joe Harden has a stack of documents on his desk, all the investigation material. The CID is called in, including Joe Harden's old friend from his student days, Stephen Bronson. During the meeting, Joe points out that the disappearances of businessmen only happen at weekends and only late at night. The relatives of the disappeared have almost all obediently paid the ransoms demanded by the bandits, but the kidnapped have never been released. It seems to be a gang of professional kidnappers. Joe is friendly with Stephen, who hasn't seen him for several years. Joe discovers that Stephen's wedding is imminent and that his bride-to-be is the wife of one of the missing businessmen, a very wealthy woman. As if on cue, Stephen offers Joe a holiday in Hawaii, and he will foot the bill in return for Joe's selfless rescue of Stephen when he was once facing expulsion from college. Joe thanks her, but against the backdrop of events in San Francisco, this is intolerable. Stephen asks if Joe will give up his hotel on the public dime and stay with his aunt again, as he always does. Joe confirms that he prefers Matilda's place because he misses home-cooked food. Joe Harden, an FBI special agent, drives a Ford Explorer, a block of 2-story houses. A 55-year-old beautiful woman looks out of her window. She meets Joe and escorts him to his room. Joe greedily sips his fish. Matilda loudly celebrates her nephew's rise to fame after exposing the corrupt ties of elite Boston law enforcement officers to a crime syndicate. Step 3. Friday, end of working day. On weekends, Joe organizes a vigil in and around San Francisco. A dozen municipal police and FBI car crews volunteered to help. The team is divided into controlled areas. Bronson remains at police headquarters. Matilda's house. Joe is in his room, covered in paperwork, and wants to gather as much information as possible before the raid. Matilda knocks on the door and urges Joe to take a break, not to spend his evenings just working. The wheels of a car squeal loudly at dinner. Looking out of the window, Matilda sees a light-colored van pulling away. On TV, Stephen Bronson answers reporters' questions about the mysterious disappearances of businessmen, his lack of competence in solving crimes, and the FBI special agent Joe Harden, who has been sent to California. The phone rings and Matilda hands the receiver to Joe. His friend Susie calls, saying she is flying to San Francisco tonight. Joe objects, because Susie needs to sleep because it's nighttime in New York. At the end of the phone call, Matilda asks, "Is this a good friend of yours?" Joe, "A very close friend." Matilda, "Isn't it time you?" Joe says, "Absolutely not. Family life is not my thing." Matilda sneers, "You're as selfish a loner as your father." On the way to the raid, Joe warns him that he will probably have to take a nap tonight and that he'll be back late. Matilda promises to wait for him again and again. Step 4, 11 p.m. Joe is on duty on Route 84, between San Gregorio and Loma Mar. They stop one other car, look at people, check documents. No suspicious persons are seen. Maintains contact with fellow raid participants, but no reports of interest are reported. Stephen calls a couple of times to see how Joe is doing and promises to stay on duty as long as necessary. After midnight, Joe feels sleepy. He pours steaming coffee from the thermos, unwraps a slice of cake, a treat for Matilda. The road is empty, but as soon as the first bite is taken, halogen headlights appear in the distance. The car is moving suspiciously slowly, so Joe pulls over with the blue beacon on. The window of the luxury saloon rolls down, and the solid, stylishly dressed 60-year-old driver stares askance. In the leather seat next to her, a man with a baseball cap on his nose snoozes. Joe feels uncomfortable stopping elderly people. He talks about his beloved dog, who has supposedly disappeared on the road. He tries to shine a spotlight into the car, but the woman covers the spotlight with her hand, saying, "My husband is tired from the long journey. I don't want us to disturb his rest." Joe apologizes, because it is his professional reflex to use his position of authority brazenly. The woman behind the wheel says, "Not all officers are so polite and tolerant." Meanwhile, a minivan comes from the opposite direction, and Joe stops it. After instructing the minivan driver to wait a moment, Joe turns back to the woman. "Miss Jackson, what do you mean? Are you a victim of the officers?" She says she read about it in the press. "Didn't you hear about the motorcyclist who stole several million worth of diamonds?" Joe says he heard it with one ear. Miss Jackson would love to tell you, but she doesn't want to wake her sleepy spouse. Joe offers to sit inside his Ford. Joe checks the minivan. A group of cheeky young men invite him to join the swingers. The girls giggle lustily. A young man with his eyes disrespectfully fixed on Miss Jackson. "I'd throw up fucking that bloody old woman, wouldn't you?" Joe is furious. Grabbing his lapels, he almost pulls the man out of the side window. After minivan has driven away, Joe says to Miss Jackson, "You've just seen that I don't always remain tolerant with people either. This is your service, so I'll tell you and you can use your imagination. This heartbreaking story began over a year ago." Act 5, beginning of Mrs. Jackson's story. Morning in San Jose. Wooden house. Two in bed. A blonde young man, Roger. Next to him sleeps a dark-skinned girl, Meg. The boy wakes her up by gently pulling back the covers, kissing her neck, shoulders, and back. They talk about how they will soon get married because he has been offered a well-paid job. Meg says she will not be able to show up at church with such a big belly. Rogers will have to wait a couple of months until she gives birth. Later, Roger takes his fiancée to work in a shop by motorbike, a collapsed apartment block on the outskirts of Auckland. A car pulls up outside the house, and the owner gets out. He enters the stairwell and insistently rings the bell of one of the apartments. A man aged about 60 opens the door. The landlord is unhappy. For the second month in a row, the residents have not paid their rent. In the back of the apartment, an old woman with long hair pokes her head out for a second. A motorcyclist pulls up to that brick house. This is Roger. He walks with a leg brace. When Roger hears about the unpaid rent, he reassures the landlord that he has got a job and the debt will be paid. The owner of the house, glancing at the sprained leg, jokes that maybe Roger will try to win the California motocross title sometime. The landlord keeps disconnecting the electricity until the debt is paid. Casts an unfriendly glance at tenants. He leaves without saying goodbye. Act 6, continuation of the story. An unpleasant, forgotten neighborhood in the suburbs of San Francisco. Roger meets two employers. The arrogant men identify themselves as the boss's confidants, using the nicknames Guatemala and Albinos. For a start, the boss wants to make sure that Roger has not lost his professionalism. Roger shows what he can do on the motocross track. The guys are delighted, and Roger is hired. He explains that this firm is in the unusual but profitable business of debt collection. However, there are situations where, after taking over the repossessed valuables, you have to avoid provocation, so there's practically no chance of catching the motocross champion. Roger's first test is about to take place. A package of $50,000 must be intercepted. Roger must find a place to intercept the packet. With the package in his hands, Roger will have to deftly hide the motorbike inside the van. If the money arrives safely, Roger will be entitled to a reward of 5% of the amount. At the appointed time, Roger prepares for his first baptism. At the signal for Guatemala, Roger starts, and then he grabs a small package from a 12-year-old teenager. After a brisk flight through the labyrinthine streets, Roger jumps into the van. Albinos quickly closes the door, but it seems to be a trick. When unwrapped, it is not the money that is found, but scraps of paper from the parcel. Roger is furious. Someone has stabbed them. The men look at each other with unhappy faces, but after a few seconds they start laughing deliciously. It turns out to be a test of Roger's integrity. Even though there was no money in the package, the boss told Roger to pay out the 5% interest he earned, totaling $2,500. Roger takes some of the money to his parents. He buys flowers for Medj. Act 7, continuation of the story. The real raid is about to take place. $100,000 in cash to be intercepted San Francisco after midday, rush hour. Traffic jams give the motorbike an advantage. Roger sees the Maserati pull up. A woman gets out, carrying a sports bag. Guatemala commands via mobile phone, "Grab it." Roger roars out of the spot, takes the basket, and takes off at full speed. But at the end of the street, a car with a beacon on its roof blocks the way. Roger throws himself backwards, but another catcher's car approaches from the opposite direction. Roger's motorbike bounces over the pavement and down a narrow cross street, leaving the pursuers behind. Through the mirror, the boy sees several cars hitting each other. Roger returns to the van a little late, but completes his task without fail. This time he earns $5,000. Guatemala taps him on the shoulder encouragingly. The boss calls and compliments him. The next morning, Meg brings back a newspaper describing the kidnapping of a wealthy restaurateur, the extortion of a ransom, and the chase of a motorcyclist the night before. Meggie suspects that the motorcyclist described is her Roger. In his apology to Meg, Roger claims to know nothing about it and lies that he got the $5,000 from the sale of the motorcycle on which he once won a championship. The next day, Roger is unhappy and attacks his siblings. What do the facts about criminal activity in a newspaper article mean? The boss's henchmen jokingly say, "Are you so sheepish as to believe the press?" Act 8, continuation of story. For the next couple of months, Roger is involved in buyback operations. He successfully completes the task, changing escape routes, motorcycle color and registration numbers, outfit and suit every time. Roger decides to find out for himself if he is sometimes involved in kidnapping. Soon after, Roger is informed that he will have to undergo a very complex operation and that he must prepare carefully and responsibly. If the venture succeeds, the companions will make a lot of money. Although Roger has gained the trust of his employers, he is transported to the firm's headquarters in a cramped van. Using his stormtrooper orientation, Roger memorizes the route's peculiarities. He may have to use it one day. The Zebras lock Roger in the workshop. Tell him to get his new motorbike ready for work and to keep his nose clean. Once the work is done, Roger beams into the adjacent room. Roger goes out into the courtyard to inspect the buildings. Suddenly, she hears moans. Roger went downstairs. The moans of the man are even clearer. When he opens the door, Roger sees a ghastly sight. A plump man tied to a chair, his ornate tuxedo covered in blood. Guatemala pounds him with his fists, while Albinos films it all with a video camera, taunting him with, "You're proving to be tough, and who else but us will put a price on your heroism?" Guatemala also mocks. "Instead of going to a good film, we have to watch a bloody marble, a hail of blows. It seems that the man will faint from the torture." Act 9. Continuation of story. Roger accidentally opens the door. The zebras are a bit lost, but after they've composed themselves, they tell him to watch how the customer's fingerprints are taken. Guatemala squirts tequila on the blade of a hunting knife and, grabbing the man's finger, falls asleep. Roger turns away. All you hear is a desperate human scream. Guatemala shows a bloody severed finger. Roger rushes tequila to disinfect the wound. He tears off a piece of the man's white shirt and ties up his blood-soaked hand. He looks into the eyes of the torturer. There is horror, pain, and gratitude. Sebra explains to Roger that the fat man is a big crook who has swindled his shareholders out of almost $100 million and will now have to pay the ransom, not in banknotes but in real diamonds. "Learn to share, live safer. That's the boss's proverb," the brothers say. Roger asks when he will finally meet the boss. They reply that they have never seen the boss themselves, but it is healthier not to know each other. Roger is given the task of delivering a businessman's severed finger and a ransom note to a written address. When the firm's pattern of criminal activity is revealed, Roger decides firmly how he must act. The next day, Meg has convulsions, and in the evening she gives birth to a son. Roger is overjoyed. Without risking the safety of precious people, he takes Meg and the baby to Long Beach to her ailing mother. After leaving the newborn baby with his grandmother, the two of them travel to Las Vegas to register their marriage. After leaving his mother and baby in Long Beach, Roger returns to San Francisco. The grand raid is scheduled for tomorrow. When Roger calls his parents, he promises to visit with lots of news. Miss Jackson says here with a deep sigh, "That was the last time my parents heard their son's voice." Of story. Operation Day, San Francisco. A pizza delivery man's scooter stops. After leaving the package on the boot of the scooter, the boy walks away. At the signal, Roger takes off. At the same time, a special report starts on TV. The commentator promises an interesting storyline for the viewers of the channel. The real ransom being handed over to the criminals for the kidnapped businessmen will be broadcast. The camera zooms in on a pizza delivery man with a package in his hand. Commentator: "You won't believe it. This cardboard box contains $7 million worth of diamonds. Concentrate." The camera pans to a motorbike stopped in front of a scooter. Roger grabs the package, puts it in his backpack, and dives down the busy street. The camera follows the rider until he disappears from view. We are about to continue a sensational operation. Stay tuned. Hundreds of thousands of San Franciscans are glued to their telescreens. Commentator: "Here we are again. We continue the broadcast from the helicopter. Just a reminder, the ransom is gigantic. $7 million worth of choice diamonds. This is by far the largest ransom for criminals in the history of San Francisco." A helicopter follows a motorbike, expertly diving through the streets. Passing through narrow lanes, the rider suddenly disappears into industrial buildings. The commentator promises a sequel soon. Meanwhile, the two men in the van track Roger's movements on a monitor screen using the motorcycle's GPS sensor. When Roger veers off the route, the two of them curse worriedly. Has he been caught? Roger enters an empty hangar. The double waiting for him as agreed has his eyes fixed on a miniature TV. "You were on TV from the helicopter. You stole $7 million worth of diamonds?" Roger is surprised. "Hey, really? Well, all the better. Let's not disappoint the audience's expectations." The understudy quickly exchanges clothes, helmet, and motorbike with Roger. "Put the TV in your rucksack and get out of here. You see, the audience is just crazy about the reality show. Television plays its own games and we play ours. When the fairies catch you, take off your helmet and shout yourself hoarse right into the TV camera. Your face will be shown in the big screen. You'll be a celebrity. No one will threaten you. Besides, I'm giving you this 30-piece item. Got it? So good luck. The double quickly jumps out. Roger puts the diamonds from the box in his jacket pocket. He fastens the zipper securely. He gets on his motorbike and rides out of an abandoned industrial building. Television coverage continues. A motorcyclist is seen again sprinting through the streets. Commentator, you would never guess the finale of this chase. After a short chase, the double is caught in a roadblock by a dozen police cars. The motorcyclist is surrounded by police, and a cameraman armed with a telecamera arrives. The motorcyclist takes off his helmet, but what is completely incomprehensible is the smile on the guy's face. The police roughly lay him on his stomach and handcuff him. He pulls out of his backpack not a box of diamonds but a miniature color TV, showing the drawn faces of the same officers. Feeling cheated, spectators in the street start whistling and shaming the police. A commentator reports that a check of the production housing has just revealed only an empty box, which is believed to contain 7 million worth of diamonds. Commentator, this is not the end. The sequel will follow. Stay tuned. A commercial break begins. Act 11, continuation of story. The ad is interrupted by a commentator's voice. We've just been informed that a motorcyclist is speeding off in defiance of a police request to stop. Our helicopter is rushing in for a second round of chases. Screens show a motorbike breaking free from a police pursuit. A TV helicopter is trying to fly as low as possible in pursuit. At the end of the residential areas, Roger takes off across the hilly terrain at a gallop. Police cars lag hopelessly behind. Turning to look, Roger sees a helicopter coming up underground. A steep climb is coming up. Roger presses the accelerator even harder. With a burst of momentum, he leaps up from a 25-meter springboard into a body of water. But in midair, Roger pulls off a spectacular stunt. He bounces off his motorcycle, falls down a soft sandy slope, and rolls, slightly bruised, downhill. The motorcycle plunges into the water and sinks. But the telecamera doesn't see everything. Here's a nimble motorcyclist about to be overtaken by a helicopter. Suddenly, the fugitive plunges into the woods off to the side, nimbly maneuvers through the trees, then up a steep hill, and only the initial phase of the jump is visible on the screens. The helicopter rises higher. The camera shows only the circles on the water surface. Unbelievable! What a careless jump! Risking his life, the fugitive jumped into the water. You will see for yourself whether the diamond kidnapper drowned or survived. Thanks to our TV channel, you have witnessed the dramatic finale. Roger knows the area well from his motocross training days. Using the cover of the bushes, he crawls into a cave in a place invisible to the naked eye. In cave, it's dark. Roger takes off his motorcycle suit. Suddenly, he hears a rattle, a snake warning. There is no other way out, so Roger sits there almost breathless. Fortunately for him, the rattlesnakes stop. Roger huddles close by, hearing the roar of a helicopter and the shouts of people. The telescope shows a high slope and a lake at the bottom. Commentator, did the perpetrator go down with the motorbike? I wouldn't wish such a terrible fate on anyone. At least this is the price this drowning man has put on himself. $7 million. Are your hearts beating hard? I'm sure it does. It is concluded that the rider never emerged from the water. Viewers are promised an extension of the broadcast in about 1 hour, when the search for the drowning man and the kidnapped diamonds will begin. But the search is unsuccessful. Although the motorcycle is found at a depth of almost 100 feet, the wreck is not detected. A police patrol is deployed for the night and the search continues the next day. Again, however, without the expected results. In the evening, after the commotion has died down, the two siblings, Albinos and Guatemala, wake up at the waterhole. After a wander around, they find the cave where Roger is hiding. Squatting down, Guatemala jokingly yells at the Irvine, "Enough hiding! Roger, get out of here. Don't be afraid, there are no more Faras." Albinos adds, "You've blown us away, champion. But that's it, we forgive you. So stop playing hide and seek. Show yourself." Guatemala, "I'll check for all the evil. Maybe there really is a crook in a cave, eating our diamonds by the handful." Guatemala kneels down, crawls on all fours into the cave. Roger just faints with fear. but the bandit, as if stung, hisses back. He spits, swearing, "Foo! There's a rattlesnake nest. I'd have got the end of it. 2 snakes attacked at once. Let's get out of here." Act 12, continuation of story. After more than a day in the cave, Roger decides to come out at night. The rattlesnakes are silent, as if they are used to his presence. Bright moonlight. Roger's lips are parched. His mouth is dry to the point of pain. He comes to the lake and refreshes himself with water, sleeping in the park. Early in the morning, they take planned action. After calling the boss's confidants, he gives them an ultimatum. The kidnapped businessman must be released. In return, Roger promises to return 1/3 of the diamonds immediately and the remaining 2/3 as soon as the man is free. The thugs have nothing to do. They accept the conditions. The promised part of the jewels is handed over to the bandits, and the businessman is released the same evening. However, Roger has no intention of giving up the remaining diamonds. The next day, Roger visits the Lexus dealership of businessman Fisher. With tears in his eyes, Fisher embraces his savior, knowing full well that it is only thanks to Roger that he has regained his freedom and life. She persuades Roger to keep the rest of the diamonds, but he refuses. After hearing Roger's family's story, Fisher comes up with a way to repay. After calling a notary, he draws up some property documents in Roger's name, claiming it is a wedding present. He also transfers a Lexus luxury sedan to Roger for free. In the evening, Roger goes to Long Beach to see Meg and his little boy. But when he calls his mother-in-law, he finds out that Meg has left the baby behind and gone to San Francisco this morning. Roger rushes to the house in Orlando. The street is full of fire brigades, and the wooden house where Meg and her husband lived has turned into a pile of rubbish. A woman's charred corpse is found inside. It pierces Roger's heart. The dead woman is Meg. According to Muslim custom, Roger buries his wife that evening. Roger realizes that this is the work of the siblings. Act 13, end of story. The next day, Roger's parents are informed that their son was found dead the day before, next to his wife's grave. At the morgue, the parents recognize Roger. The body is cremated and the parents take the urn with the remains. They also get a Lexus car. My parents knew about Medj, but their son's marriage was news to them. Roger's parents drive to Long Beach in a Lexus. When they arrive at Meg's mother's house, they are pleasantly surprised to find that Roger has a son called Roger. Meg's mother complains of poor health. Roger's parents decide to take the baby as soon as possible. They will have enough money to live on by selling a luxury limousine. In the evening, Roger's parents leave for San Francisco, but just 10 miles from home, they are stopped by the police. Night. The couple are told to get out of the car. The Lexus is searched, and the boot is searched. A van following behind stops. The police suddenly disappear. 2 men get out of the van. Suddenly, one of them punches Roger's father. They drag the couple into the van. Spouses are beaten and tortured. Bandits try to find out where Roger has hidden the diamonds at any cost. The execution and bullying continue throughout the night. One day, one of the thugs raids the Jacksons' apartment. He returns in a huff, calling the apartment a stinking louse hole. Spouses sworn not to complain are released. The bandits sneer, "You think our jewels are hidden in Long Beach, right where Roger's baby is?" The fat cats drive off in the Lexus. An urn with the remains of their son is left in the boot. Roger's father acts decisively. He sees a sporty Corvette outside a supermarket, expertly unlocks the door and starts the engine. Meanwhile, Roger's mother arrives home to find the apartment turned upside down, highway to LA. The Corvette is going full speed ahead, keeping up with the bandits. An hour later, Roger's father catches up with the Lexus. He follows the bandits for a while. The bandits recognize the pursuer, but don't care about him. Soon, police crews can be seen approaching. The fugitive cars increase their speed even more. Suddenly, a Lexus swerves onto a side road, followed by a Corvette. Police cars are also keeping up. Risky double trapping in the Temecula wine-growing region. At a sharp bend, the Lexus suddenly goes out of control, skids off the road, hits a concrete pillar, flips over several times, and plunges into a vineyard, breaking vines. The bandits show no signs of life and seem to have lost consciousness. Smoke and flames appear in the Lexus cabin. Roger's father rushes in, forcibly trying to open the boot lid. Finally, the trunk opens and Roger's father takes the urn in his arms. But at that moment, an explosion happens. The frenzied policemen round up the man blown away by the blast, his face badly burnt, curled up in a ball, but never letting go of the urn. When the urn is opened, the policemen shrug their shoulders. There is no money or jewels in there, just a pile of ashes. Roger's father is taken to hospital. He survives. Joe listens intently, lost in the vicissitudes of a story that ended tragically. Miss Jackson continues. Roger's father was badly burnt. His face and hair were scorched, his eyes were damaged, and he lost his sight. It was heartbreaking to watch him suffer. When the insurance claims were processed, it was discovered that the vines destroyed in the accident were located around the orchard, which had been the Fisher couple's $1 million wedding gift to Roger, making it his property. It felt like a form of compensation for the loss, as Roger's parents became heirs to $1 million fortune. Joe glances at the clock. Wow, listening to you for half an hour didn't make the time feel any longer. However, this story seems more like a fairy tale for the naive. Reality isn't usually like this. But on the other hand, the possible links between the police and the bandits, if they aren't fictional, are deeply concerning to me. Miss Jackson sighs deeply, then bids Joe goodbye. Joe watches as the woman gets behind the wheel, closes the door, and starts the engine. There is a long pause before the car moves. Suddenly, a limousine driving by stops unexpectedly in front of Joe. The right-hand window lowers. Joe sees Miss Jackson's husband. The man is leaning back in his seat, wearing dark glasses and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He says, "I'm Luke Jackson. Officer, I'd like to apologize to you." Joe is surprised. "What are you apologizing for?" Mr. Jackson replies, "My wife told you untruths. She lied." Joe is puzzled. "What do you mean? Was the story made up?" Jackson nods. "Yes, my wife lied. This horrible story isn't something from the media. It's our family's story. We've endured unimaginable suffering, and you are the first person to hear our brutal truth." To confirm, Jackson asks Joe for a light to illuminate his face. He removes his baseball cap and dark glasses. Joe is horrified by what he sees. The skin of Jackson's face is disfigured with scars. The whites of his ghastly eye sockets are covered with a reddish film, and sparse tufts of transplanted hair stick out from the top of his head. Miss Jackson interjects. "The picture is better now. The doctors have done their best, and Luke has undergone numerous plastic surgeries. We're fortunate to have financial resources, especially with the success of the vineyard in recent years. There's even hope that Luke's eyesight will recover. He's already reacting to light with one eye." Jackson says, "Look behind us." Joe lights up the back seat. A dark-skinned baby sleeps peacefully in a special crib. Next to the baby, an urn is secured with a seatbelt. Joe, stunned, says, "I think I understand what you're living for right now." Miss Jackson smiles gently. "Little Roger will grow up with us starting today. He is our greatest joy." Joe asks, "Is your home far from here?" Miss Jackson replies, "Just a few miles, but I've only recently learned to drive, so I'm extra cautious at night." Out of curiosity, Joe writes down the Jackson's address, 21 West Park Street, Pleasant Hills. Miss Jackson adds, "You can't miss our house after dark. A unique courtyard light is always on at night. It's a gift from Mr. Fisher to little Roger." Joe then asks how the couple knows so much about their son's activities, even the smallest details. Miss Jackson explains, Roger had a gift for writing. He kept a meticulous diary from a young age. As the Jacksons drive away, Joe notices that their limousine is a Lexus. Step 15. Joe decides to end his vigil. He calls Stephen and briefly describes his acquaintance with the parents of the hero of the Diamond Ransom story. Stephen also remembers that a businessman was freed thanks to that brave guy. Joe takes down the blind man, Mr. Jackson, who describes his wife behind the wheel and his grandson sleeping in the back seat of the Lexus. Joe also dictates to Stephen the address of the Jackson home. Arriving at Matilda's house, Joe sees the lights shining in the windows. He calls his aunt on his mobile and asks if West Park Street is far away. Matilda tells me it's easy to find, just a couple of miles away. She asks Joe to come back as soon as possible because she has a surprise for him. Vowing to return immediately, Joe finds number 21 in West Park. But for some reason, the original light fixture is not lit. The windows are dark, and no one answers the doorbell. Joe waits a little, but to no avail. Suspecting something amiss, he calls all the colleagues on duty in turn to ask if they have seen the Lexus sedan. A few minutes later, a message comes through. A black Lexus has just been spotted by one of the officers on duty, accompanied by a police crew. Joe orders a chase, keeping both cars out of sight. Criminals pretending to be cops could be sitting in them. But Stephen is not satisfied. How can a seasoned FBI officer suspect the police? The pursuing Lexus and the police car increase their speed significantly. Suddenly, the two cars swerve in different directions in an attempt to throw off the footfall. A short time later, the police car skids out of control off the carriageway and hits a shop window. A man in police uniform jumps out of the car. He runs up the stairs in an attempt to hide. Caught in the domestic appliances department, he opens fire indiscriminately, but is struck by a bullet from the guards and falls down the stairwell. A check on the identity of the slain policeman reveals that he was dismissed from the force long ago. The two Jacksons are in the police car in handcuffs, unharmed. Spouses are worried. A grandchild has been abandoned at Lexus. 16. Action. Joe follows the route of the Lexus after calculating the coordinates from his colleagues. Sometime later, he catches up with the Lexus and begins a chase through San Francisco at night. Suddenly, the Lexus plunges from the illuminated streets into the dark recesses of the suburbs. Suddenly, the Lexus seems to crash to the ground. Joe carefully makes his way on foot through a lush, grassy clearing, approaching a cliff. At the bottom are railway tracks. Looking closer, Joe spots a Lexus. The car is badly damaged, having run off a cliff and hit the railroad tracks. Meanwhile, the headlights of an approaching train flash. Joe jumps over the safety fence and slides down the slope in a hurry. One idea: we need to save little Roger. The doors of the Lexus are badly damaged. Hearing the babies crying, Joe casually opens the door. Grabbing the screaming baby with one hand, he manages to free the leg of the criminal behind the wheel. As soon as the three of them jump off the tracks, a freight train whistles and whizzes past. However, it was on the adjacent siding, so the Lexus was not in the way. Up the slope, Joe takes a cot with a baby. The helpers arrive. The two Jacksons arrive with them. After recovering little Roger, Miss Jackson says, as if to excuse herself, "We thought you were with the kidnappers." Meanwhile, the blind Mr. Jackson worries, "Where is our urn?" Suddenly, Miss Jackson, who has suddenly come to her senses, repeats the question. Joe shouts to them, "I'll be right there," and runs off down the slope. A beam of light is coming from the tunnel. Another train is coming. Joe is going downhill. He trips over something in his haste and falls. At the bottom, he hits his head hard on the concrete of the sleeper and becomes dizzy. After regaining consciousness from the injury, Joe realizes that the train is right next to him. Without missing a beat, he recklessly charges towards the Lexus. A group of people on a hillside hold their breath to see what happens next. A train is late to spot an obstacle on the tracks, screeches its brakes, but crashes into the Jacksons' Lexus before it can stop. The flame of the explosion bursts. In the afterglow of the explosion, Joe's figure disappears from view. The train comes to a complete stop only when the very last carriage has passed through the point of impact. The faces of the passengers, awakened by the crash, cling to the windows. The people standing on the cliff are horrified. Has an FBI officer met a tragic fate? The tense wait lasts several minutes. Suddenly, someone calls out, "There's a man's shadow. I think it's Joe Harden." And sure enough, on the other side of the tracks, shaking the dust off his clothes, is the silhouette of a healthy and alive Joe. The Jackson heirloom, the urn containing his son's remains, is still there. Joe keeps it tucked under his arm. People at the top of the slope are hugging each other with joy. At 3 a.m., Joe finally arrives at his aunt's house. The house is dark. Matilda has fallen asleep without waiting for Joe. Joe quietly unlocks the door. Suddenly, a light comes on. At the end of the hallway, Joe sees Matilda and her friend Susie tied to chairs, their mouths taped shut. An unfamiliar male voice orders Joe to put his gun on the floor and slide it toward him. Joe must obey. He shoves the gun hard and it slides under the sofa. Just then, two burly intruders appear from the shadows. Both are brazenly shouting. A few sharp phrases are exchanged. Unbeknownst to the attackers, Joe makes a sudden move and pulls up the carpet. The thugs are caught off guard. Taking advantage of the confusion, Joe expertly takes down one thug and seizes a baseball bat from the other. The attackers are handcuffed together and thrown to the floor. Joe calls in the police SWAT team. As he places the walkie-talkie on the windowsill, he kisses Susie and jokes, "I guess you're the surprise Matilda promised." The bandit's mobile phone rings. Putting the barrel of his gun to an intruder's head, Joe asks, "Who's calling?" In a quavering voice, the thug replies, "It's probably the boss." "Joe, and who is your boss?" "Bandit. He's in a fix. We don't know him. We haven't even shaken his hand." Joe orders the intruder to convince the boss that their scheme is going according to plan. When the call ends, the bandit announces, "The boss will be here in about half an hour." As a precaution, Joe tells the women to stay out of the house. A police car pulls up outside Matilda's house. Stephen Bronson steps out. When he approaches the house, he notices the front door is ajar. Stephen enters and is surprised to see the criminals handcuffed in the lobby. He says, "I saw the lights on and thought I should congratulate the hero of the night." After Joe explains the situation, he warns Stephen that a crime boss is about to show up. Stephen examines one of the intruder's silenced pistols, checks the clip for bullets, then begins taunting the thugs, pointing the gun under their noses. Suddenly, Stephen shoots the attackers in the back of their heads. Joe shouts, "You're crazy!" He lunges towards Stephen, but Stephen quickly points his pistol at Joe. "Joe, you're dumber than I thought. You think you're some national hero? Decided you're tougher than me?" Stephen shoots Joe in the thigh. Joe grabs his leg, blood soaking his pants. In disbelief at his old friend's betrayal, he asks, "So you're the killer boss?" Stephen smirks. "Hard to believe?" "Joe, you're an executioner." "Not just an executioner. I'm also a judge. Society needs criminals, Joe. Can't you see that? They cleanse society, redistribute wealth. But they're just tools. The real leaders are people like me, professional policemen who can guide society." Joe, wincing in pain, says, "You're insane." "No, Joe, you lost this game. You shouldn't have interfered. You'll take my theory to your grave." Stephen's gaze hardens as he raises his gun at Joe. Suddenly, a voice comes through the walkie-talkie. "Bronson, we heard everything. Come outside with your hands up." Police car sirens wail in the distance. Joe, smirking through his pain, says, "Steve, your modern theory just became public knowledge." Stephen's face contorts with fear. He unloads his pistol's clip onto the floor, pulls out a gold-plated bullet, and loads it into the chamber. "At least I deserve an exclusive bullet." "You're just a coward. Society judges people like me, but I was its true judge." "No, Steve, you weren't a judge. You were a perverted executioner, a murderer of innocent people." A single gunshot rings out. Stephen collapses, having shot himself in the mouth. Joe mutters, "Executioners always become the victims of their own cruelty." A rapid response team bursts into Matilda's house. Step 18. By Monday, a crowd of reporters gathers at the hospital for Joe Harden's interview. Joe lies in his hospital bed, his leg in a cast. His friend Susie sits by his side. A security policeman enters with a strange smile and says, "Officer Harden, your wife is here to see you." Joe is surprised. Susie rolls her eyes in confusion. The policeman adds, "Your wife is pregnant, right?" Joe winks at Susie. "Yes, pregnant." A woman in her 30s enters the ward. "Don't be fooled," she says. "I had to lie. I'm Kate Baffett. You're the only one who can help me." She unwraps a package to reveal a severed finger. Kate sobs, her voice trembling. 10 days ago, my husband Frank was kidnapped. A week ago, I received this package. The kidnappers demanded a ransom, but their phones have gone silent. Joe calls Miss Jackson for help. She provides Roger's diary. Using clues from the diary, Joe and the SWAT team trace the kidnappers to an industrial building. Inside, they discover a hidden crematorium with urns containing human remains, each labeled with names, dates, and photos. Joe finds an empty urn labeled Roger Jackson and another for businessman Fisher, containing a note, "Sentence suspended." A CD reveals footage of Stephen ambushing Roger and killing him. Joe vows to tell the Jacksons the truth. Roger was murdered, not a suicide. Step 19, Epilogue. A few days later, a party is held at the Jacksons' house. Joe, Susie, Aunt Matilda, and other rescued individuals are present. Little Roger plays in the yard. The partygoers admire a unique light display, a glowing blue earth with a yellowish moon revolving around it. As the group celebrates, Baffett's wife feels faint, hinting at a new addition to their family. The view of the lively gathering and glowing courtyard fades into the night. The End. Copyright C. 2024 by Arnold S. Rasma. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including photocopying, recording, or other electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical reviews and certain other non-commercial uses permitted by copyright law.